Hi,
Hi.
everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar this week. I'm Amanda Singer, and I am a professional mediator with West Coast Family Mediation Center. And
Hi, I'm David Dowling, and I am also a professional family mediator and one of Amanda's partners, and grateful for the opportunity to take this time to talk with her today about something that we think, as we were thinking about today's webinar for this week, we kind of both felt this was something important to talk about. Amanda, do you want to introduce the topic?
yeah, certainly. So, although you often hear us talking about topics that have to do with divorce and things like that, one of the other areas that we both, David and I, and our office in general, work in is also on premarital mediation. And so, I always like to call my premarital mediation clients my happy clients. So, I feel like today we're getting to have a webinar to talk a little bit about happier things. When we talk about premarital mediation and what we would call like premarital agreements. So, first and foremost, I know that a lot of people hear that and they're like, huh, what are you talking about? Because I think the more kind of commonly used term would be a prenup or a prenuptial agreement. And part of the reason that we use premarital instead of prenuptial is just kind of the idea of a prenup or a prenuptial agreement is very, very legal, very kind of like this is, working with two attorneys, and there's kind of the I think some of the stigma that goes along with that term, and we'll talk a little more about that as well. But just, we find that premarital is more of the mediation kind of friendly term. So that's what you'll hear David and I use throughout this. We've got a lot of blogs on our website on this topic as well that we'll always link to. And you'll see that sometimes it's kind of interchangeable of how we refer to them. But I do think that there's something about the term prenup that just kind of has this stigma attached to it. And one of the things that I always hear people say about that or hear is kind of the idea of like, oh, he or she asked for a prenup, like they don't trust you, right? Like it's the idea that, well, why would somebody want to do that?
Right.
So
Yeah, I think it's interesting because one of the reasons that when I was thinking about doing this topic is you introduced yourself and you said West Coast Family Mediation, right? And
mhm,
so we do family mediation. We do the full gamut, and I've kind of said this in webinars before. We do everything from the pre all the way through to sometimes, well, a lot of times the ending with the divorce. And we also work with families who are not thinking divorce and who are already
mhm,
married, and we work with them to work through certain things, whatever it might be. And so I think a lot of people, when they think of practices like ours, they assume automatically that we just do divorce, and they don't understand that we can really help people with that pre-marriage mediation. And for me, I always think, in days gone by, in older years or whatever, people went and talked with trusted family friends. They went and talked with religious leaders,
mhm,
right? So a lot of times before you got married, you went and sat down and sought out the advice of a spiritual advisor who would help you think and talk about the things that you needed to discuss before you got married, right? And so the prenup came about with this idea of like, what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. And it
mhm,
does have that kind of dirtier connotation for a lot of people. Like there's this mistrust and
mhm.
this setting things up for a disaster or a negative end. Whereas when I think about pre-marriage mediation, and we're going to really delve into this, I think about planning and having the conversations. And I think about, thinking about our future and our assets and how we want to work together on those. And we even work with couples who have no plans of getting married, right? So that's the other
Mhm.
thing I think that we need to touch on is that we do this for people who are like, we don't think we're going to get married, but what we'd like to do is build a structure around our community and what that looks like with our
Mhm.
assets and debts and everything else. And then we also have people who are like, we're planning on getting married, but we have these assets and debts and other things that we
Mhm.
think about. So there are a couple of different approaches, and it's not necessarily like pre-marriage. It can be, a relationship and setting an agreement around that. And so as mediators, we provide these services and enable people to sit down at a table together without the I got my attorney, you got your attorney, and drawing lines in the sand.
Yeah. And I think that, what David, you said about like planning for the future is the biggest thing that I always think about with a prenup is the idea that like, I compare it to insurance. So
Mhm.
like, I always say that like nobody buys home insurance because you want your house to burn down or you want something to happen, right? You buy insurance because you hope that it never does. But if it does, you know that you have something in place to help you in that situation. And so I look at a premarital agreement, premarital mediation, even if you didn't have a full agreement, to be a similar idea, right? Nobody gets married because they plan to get divorced, right? If that's the case, then, well, they're not going to get married in the first place. And so, I always say that nobody plans to get divorced. However, we still have, I think, around a 50% divorce rate in some areas like Orange County, where David is. It's actually higher than other areas. But if you're looking at that in the sense that unfortunately, 50% of marriages or whatever the number is at this point may end in divorce. Well, unfortunately, that's not the best odds, right? That's not the best percentage. And so you or someone is going to end up getting divorced. And so thinking of through in that sense, the idea being, well, do you want to have a plan in place and know how you want to do things, or do you want to be fighting when that if that happens to come? And so I think that the idea being that most people are going to put together a premarital agreement and they're never going to use it. And
Mhm.
honestly, I've seen statistics that it's more likely that if you actually work together and have a premarital agreement, that you're not going to get divorced because you've taken the time to talk through everything, like you said, and you're actually working together and you have a better idea of what it's going to look like. But at least if, God forbid, you do end up in the situation where you are separating or divorcing, you talked about it when you're happy, right? And when you liked each other and or loved each other and when you wanted to plan a life together, as opposed to unfortunately what we see happens when you get to the divorce point and people are not in that same mindset.
Right. I always think of it when I'm teaching students, I always talk to them about, conflict and dispute resolution clauses in agreements. So when two companies get together and they're putting together a contract, what they're doing is they're saying, hey, we want to work together and we see a great opportunity to build a future together and to make something very prosperous together. However, what we want to do is if we reach any points where we do have issues, problems, or there's a conflict, let's insert clauses into this
Mm,
agreement while we're on happy terms that says this is how we will deal with those problems in the future. And pre-marriage mediation is pretty much the same thing, right? It's this idea that we love each other, we plan to build a life together, we plan to build a future. However, if we reach a point where there are problems down the line, let's talk through it now and figure out how we'd like to deal with those instead of
mhm,
waiting until there are hurt feelings and there's stress added to it, maybe children, whatever else might be thrown into the mix. And so, in that happy phase, in that building the contract, in that working together at the beginning, let's kind of put in some clauses and some steps that we know we will take. And it's much easier to think
mhm,
about how we might handle things. The other thing that I think about is like today, people get married in very different situations. Not that long ago, people got married when they were very young and they had nothing.
mm,
A lot of people these days are already on the property ladder,
yep.
they're already bought into it. Their careers are in a different way. They've maybe saved or they've got debt or whatever it might be from school, especially.
Mhm,
So there are a lot of different things that we're now bringing into marriages that we didn't when we kind of met at 18, got married at 20, 21, right? And we just kind of started out clueless with nothing to our community. And these days we're bringing in all of these things already.
yeah, I think sometimes in the past too, the idea of a prenup, because that's what they were looking at it then, calling, came from families, came from where you had one or both maybe somebody who came from wealth within the family, and the families required it,
Mhm.
right? So you would see that of like, oh, my parents require that we have a prenup to get married. And although I still see a little bit of that come up, and I hear that sometimes, I agree with what you're saying is that most of the couples that I've worked with are either older when they're getting married, so they've already, may have, like you said, have assets, have debts, are at a different point in their lives, or sometimes also you've got second or third marriages, right? And you've got people who may have kids from another relationship, and what does that look like? So figuring out, all of that, and one of the things, we said I wanted to talk about here is I got married last October, and my now husband and I did put together a premarital agreement. So I think that we were certainly in, it was our first marriage for both of us. But I'm in my mid 30s and he's almost 40, and so he probably would hate that I say that, but he'll never watch it. It's fine. That we both were coming into this
Yeah.
with certain assets and debts. We had been together 6.5 years before we got married, and we actually bought a home together, over 2 years ago. And one of the things, David, you mentioned at the beginning is the idea that you don't have to be married to enter into an agreement. And so, to kind of back up for us, when we bought the house together, we entered into what we call a cohabitation agreement. So the idea of a cohabitation agreement is, if you're not yet married, but you're, buying assets together or taking on debts, because we took on a mortgage too. And if you were to separate, not stay together, break up at that point, you don't have the same legal rights that you might have if you were married. And so when we bought the home together, first off, we put different amounts into it, and we also were going to pay on it differently because our income was not the same at the time. And so we entered into, at that time, the cohabitation agreement was kind of a shorter agreement, but kind of saying, okay, what would happen if we broke up to the down payment? What would happen to what we paid on it? Increase in the value, the furniture we'd buy together. Like we signed an agreement to that effect. And so then when we were, talking about getting married, we had talked, and said, okay, we definitely are going to enter into a premarital agreement. Now, I've talked about this some on blogs if anyone's read them, but because of what I do for a living, and because he's a financial advisor, I think we're more likely to have those conversations. So it was already something that came to mind, but we did think that it was very important, to do that and to do it together.
And I think the other thing that, because you bring up a good point about the cohabitation agreement, right? A lot of times we have couples who maybe don't have any intention of getting married. However, they do want to own property together. They do see the benefits. They see themselves in a long-lasting relationship, right? And we all come from different perspectives on this, right? So you don't need a marriage certificate, a marriage license to say that this is a relationship that's going to last forever, right? However, what happens if somebody dies, if there's an accident, right? So what happens if you own property and one of you dies? So you need to make sure that if you want that property to go to the other person, that you protect them, that you provide some steps to enable them to know that this is the commute, both of yours, instead of extended family members stepping in and kind of going, you weren't married, so you don't have rights and whatever else. And so that's something I think a lot of young couples don't even think about, right? Is the legal ramifications if something was to happen. You mentioned about how we're going to share the costs, right? Down payment, what are the percentages? So what are the percentages we're going to pay on bills? And I've done this where I've had young couples kind of say, look, we earn differently. We're going to put different amounts in. However, at the end of the day, we want to view it that this is our ownership percentages, right? Whether it's 50 or reflective of the 70-30 that they're putting in. If somebody dies, this is what happens to the property. This is what happens to our debts, right? So it's taking those precautions to protect each other and make sure that everybody understands what happens.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because I think that one of the things him and I talked about when we first bought the house was like, yes, if something happened to one of us, right? Not just if we broke up, but like you said, if one of us did pass away, well, what would that look like? And like, we both talked about that. Well, before we were married, maybe some of his down payment and stuff, some of that would go to his sister versus I've got a brother, and like what we wanted that to look like. But we also wanted the other person to be set up to be able to do it if something happened. And so we put in place life insurance before we were even married, because with the amount that would just kind of cover the mortgage or cover a buyout amount, or looking at the situation of at that point my income was a lot higher, and so if he had to do the mortgage on his own, would he be able to at that point? So we had those conversations and figured out, like you said, it wasn't just if we broke up, but it was, what is this going to look like if something happens? And that's important.
Yeah, I really do think that a lot of couples, it's amazing because we get into these relationships and we're all loved up and we're like, "Woohoo, this is amazing. Let's buy something together. Let's do something. Let's invest. Let's be." But you also have to be prudent from kind of a more practical legal point of view when you're
Hmm.
doing something like that. You don't just go along and buy a house with a, as you said, making sure you've got homeowners insurance without making sure you've got, protection, how
Hmm.
your mortgage is organized and everything else, and you use professionals to assist you with all of those things, right? And so
Yeah.
to the same extent that when you are doing that, when you're taking those steps in your relationship, it's thinking, okay, how can we protect ourselves as a community, as a couple, if something was to happen,
Hmm.
if the relationship was to end, if something was to happen that brought about the end of the relationship without a tragic circumstance, what do
Yeah.
we want to do? Because we don't want to end up at that point kind of creating more conflict and also costing more money in using
Hmm.
attorneys to decide how something is going to be split or divided or whatever it might be. So taking the
Yeah.
step early, spending a little bit of money up front, and it's really not that expensive compared to like litigating it at the end is very different.
Yeah, and I think the thing like you were saying is that when people are happy, they don't want to talk about those things, right? Like they avoid the conversation. They avoid, I mean, I can't tell you how many like friends I've talked with who I feel like didn't know how much their spouse made before they got married, hadn't had a full conversation about assets and debts and what all of that looked like and what they were going to do while they were married. And so I think that they just people try to, I don't know, talking about money is one of like, I feel like it ends up being more of a taboo subject than sex does, even
It's a
like
dirty
it's
thing.
just the thing. Yeah, it's the thing that nobody wants to talk about. And so I think that this allow like it's having the conversation even though it's probably for a lot of people the last thing they want to do. And I will
Right.
say, like, even for someone who like I talk about this all day. Like I said, my husband is a financial planner. And so he talks about money and stuff all day. It's still like when we had the conversations, it wasn't the easiest, right? I will admit that. And I think that it was interesting. I wrote a blog article recently on this topic, which we can link to, but kind of saying my personal, firsthand experience with what it was like. And I said, it was very different being on the other side of the table in a sense.
Right.
And, we did a lot of it ourselves just because I had that expertise and he had enough financial knowledge and expertise as well to feel comfortable with that. And so what we kind of did was we went through the different areas. And so when we talk about premarital mediation, things that we kind of go through and discuss are, you already brought up kind of the idea of assets and debts, right? So assets or debts that you may have had prior to marriage. So with us, that was, personally for me, my business, our, business, like we've talk about, and, what that was going to look like going forward versus, what it was before we got married and then during. And then, he's older and he had been saving longer. So he had a lot more in retirement accounts and investment accounts than I did. And so, talking about, those assets and what would that be, from before and then during, as well as I have student loans. He does not. And, that law degree is unfortunately not cheap. And so,
Not at all.
um, yeah. So, talking about all of that from the beginning, but then also it's okay, well, then what about the assets or debts we might acquire during the marriage? Things
Right.
that might increase in value or how we're going to do that while we're married. So that's like a big part of the premarital mediation conversation. And then the other piece of it, like you said, I always like to talk with couples about, how are you going to do your finances? How are you going to manage things? Because
Mhm.
I think sometimes what people don't realize is they'll just say, well, we split everything equally, right? Well,
Mhm.
what happens when, one person in the relationship is making 100,000 a year and one person's making 50? Well, if you split everything equally, at the end of the day, that person making 50,000 may one not be able to afford it all, but
Mhm.
also two won't have money of their own left over, right? Because then that person who's making double is gonna have leftover or not feel it in the same way. And so the conversation I like to talk about, and this is how Mike and I always did it until we got married, when we combined more things, is we paid based on a percentage of our income. And so we looked at like what was the overall total that we made and what percentage should I contribute and what percentage should he contribute. And we modified that too. So we would do it, I think we usually did every like 6 months or so. But last year before we got married, when COVID hit and we had some changes in what our income looked like, we modified that. And so, we had that conversation and we looked at it. And so that financial piece is a big one. And then the other one, which we can talk a little bit more about, is kind of the idea of spousal support, or the potential of spousal support in the future, because that's always kind of a contentious issue, as we know, in divorce.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, there are so many things that you can talk through. And again, bringing it back to the idea of sitting down with a trusted neutral, with somebody who's a mediator, right? And using that service. So rather than kind of going to attorneys to work out these details, finding a common neutral who works with both of you, who's going to sit down at the table. And the great thing here is, because of our experience in family and divorce mediation, we can think of some of the questions to ask and some of the things to go through with couples and say, what are you thinking about this? How are you feeling about this? Do you want to include anything on these things? And really, we allow our clients to guide the process in a lot of respect, right? Because some people might say, well, we don't want to include something about that. That's great. But we set out everything that they should probably be thinking about as part of the process, and say, have you thought about these things? And I find that when I talk to couples about this, there are a lot of things that they haven't, they know that they want to do something, they know that they want to get something together, but there are so many things that they haven't anticipated or thought through. And this process allows them to really think more completely about what they're agreeing to and what those terms should look like.
Yeah. And I think something that might be helpful, David, is for us to talk through a little bit about what the process of premarital mediation looks like. And then I can talk a little more about some of my experiences too. But the idea that, just like you said, putting together a premarital agreement with a neutral mediator is somebody who doesn't represent either of them, right? So when you or I, work as a mediator for a premarital couple, we're working with both of them and, not representing either of them, but helping them figure out what are their agreements. And what I like with that, just like you said, is that you get to sit down with both of them. And it isn't, one of the spouses who because oftentimes one person, not always, but oftentimes one person is the driving force behind putting together a premarital agreement. And the other person may feel that feeling of, they don't trust me, or just kind of this feeling of, why are we doing this, and not wanting to, and resist. And so I find that when you do premarital mediation and both come in together, it's more likely to get everyone on the same page. We talk about, what are the concerns? What do you want the agreements to be? And that may be anywhere from, 1 to 3 or 4 sessions, kind of going through the different topic areas. One of the requirements for a premarital agreement in California is you have to do a full financial disclosure. And so both, future spouses are required to do a full kind of disclosure of, here's the assets I have, here's the debts I have right now, anything joint and separate. And so we do that at the beginning so that we know what we're talking about. And that's also a requirement. So we make sure that's included in the agreement. And then once we've been able to talk through and come, to the agreements, then as the mediator, we draft the premarital agreement itself. And then one of the other requirements in California, because there are some to make sure you have a valid prenup, and we make sure that we follow all of those, is that each party does have to be represented by their own attorney. And so, in a situation, even though I am a licensed attorney, I can't represent either of them if I'm working with both. And so what we'll do is we give referrals to an attorney that's going to work with each of them. Now, what I hear, and sure you've heard this too, is people are like, well, isn't that going to be much more expensive if we have to have 3, professionals involved? And the thing is it's not, because as the mediator, we do a flat fee first off. So we work on a flat fee for the premarital mediation, and, it's one flat fee. And then when you go to an attorney, at that point, they're just reviewing. They're not having to do the drafting, and they're not having to, do as much of the back and forth, because you guys have already discussed it. And so what I find is that the individual attorneys usually have a few things here and there. They might have questions, they might have edits, but it takes a lot less time of the attorneys, and they charge a lot less than they would charge if they were the ones doing it.
Yeah, and I mean, I struggled with this. Like, I remember talking to one of my first clients and kind of thinking, okay, well, wait, they're gonna hire me as the mediator to do this for them, but then we need to recommend that they speak to an attorney. And the same thing popped into my head, right? How is this saving anybody money? And I was talking with a good friend of mine who's an attorney, and I said, yeah, we do these. And he said, oh yeah, I have some friends that do them. And he told me how much they charge. And I went, whoa, that is like they charge like, and that's
Yeah.
each attorney
Yep.
charges significantly more. And I'm not kind of saying come to us, but it's amazing and surprising to me because part of our process, and I think that we should point this out, is we do the financial disclosure, but we give you some documents and some forms to fill in. We say to you, you
Mhm.
bring all the work to us, right? Attorneys do it very differently in how they collect the financials and everything else. And so the costs escalate in a much different way than they would when you're utilizing our services. So that's one of the great things about
Yeah.
our flat fee kind of approach is that we do the work, we make sure everything's done legally and correct in the right way, but we also bring our parties in, right, on the work. So they help out
Yeah.
and they contribute in how we get this stuff done. So it reduces the costs.
Yeah, and I think that along with that, it's just the idea that like if one person goes to an attorney, that attorney only knows what that one spouse, future spouse wants, right? They're going to sit down, and say, okay, well, what is it you want? And that person might say, well, I want this to stay separate. I want this to stay separate. This maybe could be joint, all this. So then the attorney drafts that up without ever having heard anything from the other spouse,
Right.
right? And so now they then send that over to the other future spouse, and that person now has their own attorney. And so then now that attorney's like, well, you shouldn't agree to this, this, and this, and this actually should be joint, and you should have this separate. And so then there's this back and forth that happens because neither one talked to each other
Right.
first. Whereas when we give an agreement to you to take to your attorneys, you already know, yes, I know what's in it. This is what I agreed to. And so the attorneys, and it's yes, it has to be done, and it's important for them to get that advice. But what I find is that the attorneys have less edits and less back and forth because they have the conversation, they explain to the client what they're agreeing to and make some suggestions, and then we might come back together and make those edits jointly. But it just goes a lot smoother. And I've had attorneys that I've worked with on it, and I remember the first time I worked with one of the attorneys who had referred me, because I can represent someone in a premarital mediation as their attorney. I do it now and then. I just like the mediation better. But she had referred them to me, or somehow I had referred to her when they were my mediation clients. And she said the same thing, where she's like, I don't understand this. Why does this work? And then near the end, when we finished that first one, she was like, I understand, because it went so much smoother and there was less time she had to spend.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, right, if a couple sits down at the table together with a neutral and openly discusses why they want certain things, they're able to think through it. They're able to hear the responses from the other party. So when we put anything on paper with that draft and then send it to them to send to their attorneys, they already understand the reasoning of why they're keeping something and why the other person's keeping something and why things are being divided a certain way. So when the attorneys come back and say, well, did you know you could still do X, Y, and Z? They're like, yeah, but we already worked through that. So there's no need for the back and forth and back and forth. They've
Mm-hmm.
done it actually together without those extra components of attorneys' offices emailing and sending letters and proposals back and forth. We do it all at the table, so to speak. We're doing it all now
Mm-hmm.
virtually, but we do it all at the table with everybody in the same room. And whenever we communicate with our clients, we do it all together. So if one client emails, they email everybody. If a client has a question,
Mm-hmm.
they email everybody as part of the process. So nobody's out of the loop at any stage in working
Mm-hmm.
with us.
Yeah. And I've seen where I had a client who he wanted to do the mediation. He wanted to do premarital mediation, and she originally said no. And so I ended up representing him and working with him to draft the prenup. And then once we gave it, once we then sent it to her and of course her attorney, then she realized, oh wait, I wish I had been involved in this conversation. And they end up at that point having to, search for a mediator. I was conflicted out, or any of us would have were conflicted out because I had worked with him. And there's not a lot of mediators who do this. We're in San Diego, and I think there was one or maybe one or two others. And I think even around the state, it's just not something that, even if mediators who do divorce, not a lot of them do the premarital side of it. And, like David mentioned before, the idea of being, a family mediation center, I think our idea is that all of it's important. and it's all related, and wanting to make sure that families are taken care of at all different points, and like you said, taking the experience we have in working in the other sides of things that then relates to the conversations we can have, and being creative, because I think one of the things that's really good about a premarital agreement is you can, besides anything that's void of public policy, you can basically put almost anything you want into a premarital agreement. And it doesn't have to be just the things that you might think of. It's, let's have a conversation of, anything while you're married, how you do things. Yeah.
Right. I mean, like there's like issues that people don't like that matter to them. Like we're not going to have kids, but we've got pets, and I'd like the pets, and I'd like this kind of written in that the pets come with me. There's so many different things, but one of the things, going back to something that you'd said earlier, which was, second and third marriages, before I, began this process, I remember years ago working at a law firm, and one of the big things that they litigate is where you've got a couple, it's a second marriage, maybe for one of them or both of them or whatever else, and there were assets from the first marriage that kind of come over into the second marriage. Then the one spouse dies and the second spouse takes over, and then you've got stepchildren suing the step parent for the assets, especially from the first parent who'd passed. And so it can get very messy and very clouded, and coming in and sitting down and kind of working out and saying, okay, so these are the assets that we're bringing into the marriage. If I die, I want these to go to the spouse, but these things belong to these children, and having some clarity and certainty, because that can be a very, like, probate litigation is very drawn out, very long, very expensive. And a simple step like a pre-marriage mediation agreement can make a big difference. Families moving forward, especially when you've got things like, we call them now bonus parents and bonus children, right? Step relationships can be severely damaged and harmed after one spouse dies, and how then people battle it out for certain assets.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And one of the things I always bring up in the conversation about the premarital agreement is we have, a short section on kind of the estate planning side of it, but then making sure that they then go to an estate planning attorney to work out some of the issues of things like having a will and a trust and power of attorney and all of that. So we can refer to how, we can discuss it and make sure they know how they want to deal with it. And some of it can be dealt with in the premarital agreement, but then making sure that they also have those other vehicles in place, if needed, or they're modified, right? A lot of people, especially like on a second or third marriage, might come in with a trust already, and then do they modify it, right? Because just, on the opposite side of things, maybe they want to also include their new spouse, whereas before maybe everything went to the kids, or maybe it's still going to your ex-spouse, something to look at as well. So I think that's really important, and making sure that they look at all of those different pieces is part of our conversation as well.
So let me ask you a question. I'm in a relationship, we're very happy, we're maybe thinking about getting married. What are the first steps to all of this? Like, what should I do? How do I approach the conversation? Because we talked about this at the very beginning of the conversation, right? It's one of those things, hey, I want a pre-marriage, prenuptial, and it's like, wait, what? It raises all of these red flags for people, right? And I like how you said it. A lot of times it was where there's families with wealth, and a parent comes along and says, you're doing this to protect certain family assets or whatever else, right? But how do you start that conversation? What do you do? What would you recommend?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because it's, not necessarily, like we talked about, it's not what everyone wants to discuss, right? And so, do you sit down at dinner and say, hey, honey, I want to talk to you about a premarital agreement? It might not go over the best, or maybe it will. But
I have a vision of, hey, will you marry me? I've set us up with a lawyer to go and talk about how we're gonna do,
right, yeah, exactly. That's it's I think the thing to kind of point out is, I always say, I don't think there's ever like a perfect time, right? It's so I think that it's one, knowing your, whether it's at that time your boyfriend, girlfriend, if you're already engaged, your fiance, but knowing what's going to be best for them, right? Are they somebody who, needs a lot of time to think about it? So, maybe bringing it up early. And I think that the other thing is if you're bringing it up in the way of talking about doing mediation and working together, then it comes off a lot less confrontational than it can if you say, okay, I've hired an attorney who's going to draft this prenup and they're going to send it over to you and you need an attorney, and we're just going to, we're not going to ever talk about it together. So I think that that's, one of the big things is, being able to talk about doing it in mediation is automatically going to kind of bring, hopefully, that anxiety level down. I think the other thing is, now I'm not advocating that you bring this up on a first date, but I think the earlier you can talk about it, the better. I think that if it's something that, you guys, if you're already discussing your financial situation, it's easier to then go into that conversation. So, like I said, my husband is a financial advisor. He works with clients that are, younger, and a lot of them are newlyweds or in relationships. And I think it's a great time, even if you don't feel like you need, you have a lot of assets to have a financial planner, the idea that everyone really needs that financial planning. And so sometimes that can be kind of a step into it as well, of starting to have that conversation. But just the earlier you can bring it up, lets people think about it. And then, just like we do for anything, we always offer a free consult. So it's something that I always say, give us a call. We'll sit, we'll have a consult with both of you, answer questions, and, just see what your concerns are and be able to talk with you both about it, and make sure that it's right for you. I mean, there are some situations where maybe it's not what people want, and that's okay. I think it's just exploring your options are important.
Right. I think, it's interesting because we sit down and we talk a lot about very important things like, where we maybe want to live, what our career paths might look like. Do we rent or buy initially? What, how many babies do we think we might want to have? All of these kinds of conversations. And I think, we shouldn't shy away from important conversations by saying, hey, look, this is so important and this is critical. We're going to make all of these financial decisions together. Maybe what we should do is go talk to somebody to protect ourselves. Like going back to the idea of the insurance, right? The homeowner's insurance. I've even thought, and I think we've talked about it a little bit, you could even register for, premarital mediation as part of your register, and have family members. And I think, if you're a parent of children getting married, rather than kind of going along and saying, hey, you guys need to get a pre-marriage agreement or whatever else, say, hey, look, as a gift, we want to do this for you because we think it's, prudent for you to sit down and talk to a mediator and think about, your financial future and what that might look like, and do some good work around that to protect everybody involved. And I think that there are so many different ways that this can be a part of the conversation, but I think it is important. I think, like I said, people used to go and talk to a trusted advisor or a trusted spiritual leader and kind of get the steps like, okay, are we thinking through everything? Are we prepared for this? Are we prepared for problems down the line and what might approach us, what might come at us? And you said it earlier on, and I love it. If you start with a very good level of communication, let's think about if we have problems. Let's think about what will happen to our property. Let's think about what will happen to our death. If you start with that as the foundation of your marriage, when you do hit those problems, that good foundation in communication is going to work for you at that point too. Hiding and avoiding difficult conversations, hiding from them, doesn't bode well then, because you've been married now like 3 months.
October, November. Yeah, about that. Yeah. Okay. Actually, I think it's 3 months today.
Hey, is it? Okay. Well, happy anniversary. I didn't even know that, right? I've been married 22 years, right? I've been married 22 years and we have 4 kids. Trust me, you will hit so many problems in communication. It's like a daily thing from my wife trying to communicate with me and getting me to understand, right? No matter how good I think I am at communicating in my job, it's very different in our married lives. So, when Nicole and I, when we were dating back in the Stone Age, I actually lived in London and she lived in California, and we couldn't be together. So we were on the phone all the time. Phone bills were ridiculous, and it was literally like the phone, right? And it was, all the, there was no Zoom, no FaceTime or anything like that. But we talked about all the things.
Mm.
Like we didn't do a pre-marriage, mediation because it wasn't a thing back then, right? But we talked about what we were going to do in certain things, and we talked about our plans and our futures and our goals and everything that we wanted to discuss. We talked about everything very openly, and I think that that's benefited us through the 20 years, 22 years of marriage.
Mhm.
And I think having those conversations, not being shy of them and not being afraid of them, can help you in your marriage.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I think I don't know if people ask you this, and I'm going to ask you the question after I answer it. But the idea that like people are always asking like, what's the number one reason people get divorced, right? Like they always want to know like why is it? And I always say that it's communication. That it is because it's not even when because people are like, well, what about when somebody cheats or like somebody and I said, but it's because there was a lack of communication about what the needs were. And it's not just on one person, but it's because somewhere along the line they stopped communicating and talking to each other and being open about what they wanted. So I mean, what do you think? What would you answer to
Well,
that? I don't know if you have the
100%
same.
agree, because I get that question all the time, right? My friends who are married, they're like, so what, like, and they always want to tag it to something like infidelity or abuse
Yep.
or whatever. And I think that there are always certain situations like abuse where those things should not be tolerated, and you really have to
Yeah.
get yourself to a safe environment. You have to find support and structure, and there are always
Hmm.
resources out there. But I think that communication is really where it comes down to, because I think both people feel these or unaddressed needs in the marriage,
Hmm.
and they don't communicate those with each other. And what I've
Yeah.
seen is that they start to live these separate lives, right? So the physical and emotional relationship ends in so many respects because they're not communicating, right? So one might
Hmm.
have these emotional needs that they need addressed, that they want addressed, and the other might have these physical needs that they need addressed, but nobody's talking about those. So they start to live these separate lives, and that's where the opportunities for infidelity and other things kind of
Yeah.
spiral out of control. And so we can point to it's like when I'm teaching about negotiation and litigation, right? That the iceberg, right? So the iceberg, the piece that we see above the water, that's the stuff that we're like, oh, that's what caused the divorce. But really, it's all the things underneath the water that sunk the Titanic, right? It's all those underlying
Hmm.
interests and needs underneath that really took down the Titanic. It wasn't the little piece at the top, the infidelity or the money issues or whatever. It was the unmet needs and interests that build up. And an iceberg is only so much that we see on top, and the majority that is below the surface, right? And so really what we have to do is go below the surface and learn how to communicate with each other. And it's hard. I've done it,
Hmm.
been there, right? In my own marriage, where you sit down and have these difficult conversations, right? But it's about trust. And you know, to bring it up, that's another service that we provide, is like when you reach those points without getting to the point of needing a divorce mediator, come in and
Hmm.
sit down and mediate, right? Because I talk to clients and they say, I see a marriage and family therapist. And we love marriage and family therapists. We think they do a fantastic job, but sometimes people need a different approach. So maybe mediation is a different way to
Hmm.
unpack some of the issues going on in the marriage, if it's not happening in therapy.
Yeah, and I kind of even look at it as a in addition to,
Right.
right? And I would say the same thing with premarital mediation.
Yeah.
I know that I don't know, some religions still do premarital like counseling, right? Like I do believe the Catholic Church does
Yeah,
still,
they
and I
require you
know
to
that.
talk with somebody. Yeah.
Okay, they require, and I know certain, in I'm Jewish, and I know that if you're going to get married by a rabbi, certain rabbis will require that you do some like premarital counseling or meetings with them. So, I think the thing to note is that we think that this is in addition to any of that, and the same thing if it's marital, right? If you're working with them. Marriage and family therapist and you're in counseling, that continue that, and also seeing what else might help, because it's a different approach. I think that when we approach premarital mediation, marital mediation, and divorce mediation, it's very different. It is about problem solving,
Right.
And it is about thinking about the different pieces and, bringing it back to kind of the premarital piece of it. It is, looking at the tangibles, right? Talking about the assets and the debts, and talking about your finances, and talking potentially about support, and what is that going to look like? Because what I find, the conversations that actually come up when you talk about spousal support, and are you going to waive it, or are you going to have it, is more a conversation around, are you both going to work during the marriage, right? Having that conversation of, is one of you going to end up staying home to take care of kids, or stop working even if there aren't kids? I've seen that too. So it more becomes a conversation around, what are the expectations
Right.
for during the marriage? And if you set those expectations, and like you said, have a conversation about them at the beginning, then there's less of the 10 years down the road and one person is wondering why the other person hasn't gone back to work, right? It's that communication
Yeah.
that's
And
important.
really, coming in and having the conversation about, should we go meet with somebody and talk about these things, starts that basis for good communication. So when you come in and you sit down and we really lay everything out on the table and talk about the finances, talk about the debts, talk about the goals, the interests, and everything else, it encourages people to openly communicate and think about these things, so that 5, 10, 15 years down the line, they maybe don't need us to step in and help them. They can have those difficult conversations between themselves in the house. We're not promising that meeting with us, we're going to give you all the great tools on how to communicate, but maybe you can recognize that you have it within yourselves to learn how to communicate, right? And to have difficult conversations, and skirting the issue, hiding away from it, and kind of saying, I know that we should have a premarital mediation, I know that we should talk about some of these things, but I'm afraid to bring it up. That's not a good way to start a marriage, right? It's not a good way to start a relationship that you're anticipating will grow and develop, into something that expands and includes other people. So what you really need to do is be bold and kind of say, this is important, and it's going to be important for both of us. So we should sit down and talk about it and think about it. And I think the other thing that, as we're sitting here talking, is, marriage these days has grown and evolved in many different ways. And so it's wonderful. We live in a state and we live in a country where marriage is available to everybody.
As it should be.
Everybody should be thinking about this, right? Everybody should be thinking about premarital mediation. It's not for couples who are religious, right? It's not for couples who have money. It's not for, couples who it's for all the couples. It's for LGBTQ couples. It's for couples who have money. It's for couples who are religious. It's for couples who don't have money, because the goal and the hope is that you will, right? So spend a little now, so that when you have it in the future.
And I think it's also that we've talked a lot about, like, if you want an actual premarital agreement, and that can be, but it also can be that you guys decide, and I've done this with couples, that it's more just a conversation and we're going to kind of do the premarital mediation, but you don't want to enter into like a valid premarital agreement, something that could be used later if you divorced. And that's okay. It can be more of a conversation and putting together just kind of some informal agreements. And that's what can be useful to anyone, even if you think that you don't want, an actual one. Now, I will say, I want to make sure that I just kind of touch on the fact that if you do want to have an actual, like, enforceable prenuptial or premarital agreement, that we talked a little bit about the fact that each have to have their own attorneys. It does have to be in writing. The attorneys will sign off on it on your behalf, so they have to sign as well. But one of the things that always comes up is kind of the timing, and I think that's important, because there is some timing stuff that needs to happen if you want a valid enforceable premarital agreement. And one of those is that it has to be, basically, you have to have, the law in California is that you have to have at least 7 days from when you had the final agreement presented to you to when it was signed, and then it still has to be signed before you get married. So there's always a little bit of confusion around that. So what I always say to people is, start early, because I have done way too many last minute premarital agreements where we are like up against the wire and trying to get it done in time. And I will fully admit that my husband and I both said, I said, I'm not going to be that person. The attorney that reviewed it for me, I was like, I will get it to you early, like, we'll do this. And I will admit, we were, sitting down 2 days before we had to finalize it to finally, like, finish it up and wrap it up. And we signed it because we got married up in Big Sur and we drove. And so we were leaving Tuesday to get married Wednesday, and we signed it Monday before we left. So I will fully admit I was that person, but
Well,
yeah.
but the thing is it still happened. And, one of the things that you touched on there is, for couples who don't want to go through that whole process, they can have a cohabitation agreement. They can come in, they can sit down, they can work things out. We do that, right? It doesn't have to be the big legal final signed by the courts, signed by attorneys. You can come up if you're choosing to not have the marriage license and the marriage certificate and everything else. You can do a cohabitation agreement. But really, what we're trying to say to you today is think about these conversations, have these difficult conversations. I think that's really the basis of what we want to kind of get out to people in this. If you're watching this and you're like, well, I'm married, it's too late for me. I promise you that there's either a child in your life or there's another adult in your life, a younger sibling, whatever it might be, that you should say, hey, you know what, watch this webinar, check it out, right? Think about these things, share it with your family, share it with your friends, and have them think about these steps before they take the final steps, right? Or before they make decisions that have significant financial ramifications on everybody, right? So sit down and do some basic groundwork.
Yeah, that's very important. And one of the things too, if there's any attorneys that are watching this, that like we work with the attorneys, right? We're never looking to replace that, because there are certain things that we need that for. But finding that, like I said before, a lot of the attorneys find we can make their lives easier, because we are getting them, the clients, to the point where they already agree on so much of what they want to do. So, we're always happy to talk with anybody about, premarital mediation, about cohabitation agreements, and that mediation for that as well. And just, like we've talked about, really servicing the whole family, and, being here for those relationships.
Yeah. And you already mentioned it, right? We provide a free consultation. So take advantage of that, right? Call us, send us an email. You can go to the website and you can reach out and contact us. If you have some general questions, what I always love is when somebody will reach out to me and say, hey, I want to have this conversation with somebody else. And I love kind of helping them think through how to frame the conversation, right? So we're happy to do that as part of the consultation. Say to you, look, we understand this isn't an easy conversation to bring up with somebody. So maybe here are some things that you could think about how to explain it to them. And then if that person wants to reach out and talk to us, we're happy to talk to them. We work with, and we're happy to recommend you to attorneys. We're happy to recommend, if you want to talk to a marriage and family licensed therapist. We believe it's a community effort, right? And the more resources you have at your disposal, the better it is for everybody, especially when you're taking these big steps, right? Marriage and cohabitation is a big step. So it's important to do the groundwork, lay a solid foundation, right? Like I said, with communication, it requires a solid foundation to work in a marriage. So doing the foundational work will make a big difference to what you build on that.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you all for joining us today. I think you can tell David and I could talk about this for a very long time. We find it, interesting, and really, I know for myself, I like being able to assist couples at that point, and having gone through it myself, understanding, what that feels like. And, for David, having been married so long, I think you bring another perspective to it as well, of being able to talk about, what that can look like when when they get to the point that you're at as well. And so, we're able to provide that expertise and that help.
Yeah. And, another thing to be mindful of is, as you can see here, we are from very different points in our lives, right? Amanda is much younger than I am, right? So
what do you mean?
You are young. I'm really old, right? Here's the thing, as I'd say, is like it's not about coming in and sitting down with somebody that you might feel uncomfortable with, right? Because we have like Amanda's one of my heroes in this community, right? And my partner. But you can come and sit down with somebody that you find might identify with some of the things going on in your life because of their age and experience and background and even gender, right? And so that's the thing here to understand, is that you can find somebody that can help you and work with you and identify some of the issues that you're going through and relate to them more readily than some others, right? There's going to be so many things that I can't understand and can't identify with because I'm at a different stage in my life. than Amanda can, and vice versa. And so, like, work with mediators that work for you, and we believe that that's something that we do provide.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So, and I believe we'll put up the contact information at the end of this video, where you can find us online and by phone and everything. And we're happy to speak with you. So, thank you and have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.